The summons came on a Tuesday, which I remember because my father had made eggs that morning, real ones, from the crate he kept cold under the bunk, and I was halfway through the second when the courier tablet lit up on the table between us. He read it, set it face down, and poured himself more coffee before he said anything. That was how I knew it was serious. "The board wants to see you," he said. I already knew what the board was. You couldn't live 2 corridors away from the Verksallen Institute without learning the architecture of its bureaucracy. The Classification Review Board occupied the East Administrative Wing on the 4th level, behind a set of double doors faced in polished gray stone that had no business being on a space station, but was there anyway, imported from somewhere I'd never heard of, installed to communicate permanence, which it did. I had walked past those doors 6 times in the 8 months we'd been stationed here, and every time I'd had the same thought. Someone wanted you to feel small before you even knocked. My father finished his coffee. "It's routine," he said. "All audit candidates, before they let you into the junior observation track, they classify you. Cognitive tier, aptitude index, learning channel profile. Every species that comes through gets one." "Every species has one," I said. He looked at me over the rim of his cup. "I mean they have a profile already," I said. "For every species. They don't make the profile from scratch. They already know what the answers will look like before the candidate sits down." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Maybe. I'm just saying, there's a difference between assessing someone and confirming a template." "Maybe," he said again, more carefully. "Go anyway, be polite." I finished my eggs and went. The double doors were heavier than they looked. The anteroom inside smelled of something cold and faintly mineral, like the inside of a stone well. A clerk at the reception desk, Sorvan, I thought, from the triple-lidded eyes and the pale blue-gray of her skin, handed me a data card without looking up and told me to take the 3rd seat on the left. I took it. The seat was too wide for me. Everything in the Institute was calibrated for species that ran bigger than humans, and I had long since stopped noticing, the same way you stop noticing the hum of life support after the first week. I sat in the seat with my feet not quite reaching the floor and read the data card. Standard intake language. Name, age, species, planet of origin, parental affiliation, enrollment type. I filled it in. Under cognitive classification, the card had a long list of options with boxes beside them. I looked through the list twice. None of them said anything about humans. I checked the box marked Other Pending and handed the card back to the clerk. She looked at the box I'd checked. Then she looked at me. Then she entered something on her panel and said, "The assessors will see you shortly." There were 3 of them. I'd been in enough rooms with alien academics to have a working sense of how they arranged themselves when they wanted to communicate authority. 2 flanking, 1 in the center. The center one does the talking. The outer 2 are there to hold the frame. Their silence is the message. The Verksallen Classification Board had it down to a practiced art. The center assessor was a Veth Sorvan hybrid I hadn't seen before, tall, even-seated, with the elongated cranial structure of the older Veth lineages and the warm amber eyes of the Sorvan branch. The 2 on the flanks were Keth, both of them, uniform in the way that species sometimes are when they're in professional dress, similar scale patterns, similar gray-blue coloration, similar flat affect. I had met enough Keth instructors to know that flat affect was their baseline and didn't mean anything. "Lena Vasquez," the center assessor said. It wasn't a question, but she paused after it as if giving me the option to disagree. "Yes," I said. "Age 12, Earth-born, father stationed here under the Cartographic Survey Exchange. You have applied for junior audit candidacy in the Institute's observation track." She read it from a panel in front of her, but the cadence was practiced enough that she'd read it before. "You understand that before candidacy is confirmed, all applicants must complete the standard cognitive profile assessment." "I do," I said. "The assessment establishes your learning channel tier, your aptitude index, and your cognitive resonance signature. These are used to assign you an instructional track and a classification within our enrollment system. Every candidate is assessed. Every candidate receives a classification. She set the panel down, flat on the desk, the way my father had set down the courier tablet. Do you have any questions before we begin? I had several, but I had been polite at assessment tables before, at the cultural integration desk when we first arrived, at the medical intake when I got the required inoculations, at the junior identification office when they needed a biometric record. I knew which questions were welcome and which ones made the process longer for everyone. No, I said, I'm ready when you are. The first instrument was the resonance array. I knew the theory, because I had read about it in the public index 2 months earlier when I first started thinking about applying for the observation track. The array was a passive scan, no needles, no physical contact, that measured the distribution of active cognitive channels during a standardized listening exercise. The assessor played a sequence of tones, a spoken passage in 3 languages, and a short visual display, all layered simultaneously. Most species, under this kind of input, prioritize. One channel rises and the others quiet. The dominant channel was your primary. The distribution of the secondary channels told them where to place you in the instructional tier. The Keth assessor on the left ran the sequence. I sat in the chair, listened, watched the display, let the tones run. There were 7 tones in the sequence, each one a distinct pitch, the intervals between them irregular. The irregularity was itself a pattern, a 7-beat cycle with 2 variations seeded into it. While I was noticing that, the first spoken passage began. It was in Veth Standard. I'd been learning it for 4 months and could follow about 2/3 of conversational content, so this was effectively a translation exercise running in the background. The second passage started in a language I didn't recognize at all, which meant my mind immediately started doing something with the phoneme clusters, matching them against the 4 languages I knew, and the partial 5th I'd been picking up from the station's maintenance crew. By the time the visual display opened, a rotating geometric form, wireframe, lit from the inside in soft cyan, I was running 4 distinct processes simultaneously and was aware of all 4 with approximately equal clarity. The sequence ended. I sat with my hands in my lap. The Keth assessor on the left checked the output. She checked it again. She showed it to the center assessor without speaking. The center assessor read it. Her expression didn't change, but she held the panel a half-second longer than she needed to. "We'll run a calibration check," she said. "The equipment is sensitive to interference from life support cycling." They ran a calibration check. It took 7 minutes. Then they ran the sequence again. The output was the same. "All channels are active," the left Keth assessor said. It was the first time she had spoken directly to me, and her tone was not hostile. It was carefully neutral, which in my experience meant she was trying to decide how to proceed. "Your resonance pattern shows no dominant channel. Every learning faculty is registering full load simultaneously." "Is that a problem?" I asked. She looked at the center assessor. The center assessor looked back at the output. "It is an unusual result," she said. "We'll continue with the second instrument." The second instrument was the cognitive ladder. The ladder was a sequential problem set, not a test of knowledge, but a test of method. The problem started at a level calibrated for juvenile candidates and escalated until the candidate's processing began to degrade. Responses slowing, error rates rising, the natural ceiling of the cognitive architecture revealing itself. Every species had a ceiling. The ladder was designed to find it. The output wasn't a score but a shape, the profile of how a mind climbed and where it stopped. The right Keth assessor administered it. She placed a haptic panel in front of me and told me to work through the problems at whatever pace felt natural. "Not rushed," she said. The ladder was not timed. I worked through the problems. The first 40 were easy enough that I was doing 2 things at once without meaning to, solving the problem in front of me and scanning ahead to the shape of what was coming. The ladder wasn't trying to trick anyone. The escalation was gradual and honest, each problem building on the logic of the one before. By problem 60, I was reading the underlying structure rather than the surface content, which was faster. By problem 80, I was doing something I didn't have a precise word for, running the solution forward in time, checking whether it would still hold 2 or 3 problems ahead, adjusting if it wouldn't. It felt the same as the way I read maps, not point to point, but the whole shape at once, the relationships between all the parts, the places where the logic bent. Problem 90 felt like a gear change. The problem surface became denser, the correct method less obvious. I felt the rest of my processing quiet slightly, not stop, just lower as more attention went to the foreground problem. The tones from the first instrument were still running in some part of my mind, the 7-beat cycle still there, and I noticed the right Keth assessor shift in her seat as the time passed. I finished the set. I set the haptic panel down. I folded my hands in my lap. The right Keth assessor checked the output and did not speak for a longer time than the silence warranted. She passed the panel to the center assessor. The center assessor read it. She passed it to the left Keth assessor. The left Keth assessor read it and passed it back. "You completed all levels," the center assessor said. "Yes," I said. "The ladder has 112 levels." "I know," I said, and then, because I could see where this was going, I added, "I wasn't trying to, I just kept going until the problem stopped." "The degradation curve is absent," she said. "Your error rate did not rise. Your response time did not slow. The ladder is designed to find the ceiling of a candidate's processing architecture." She looked at the panel again, as if looking at it a third time might change what it said. "It appears not to have found yours." There was a silence in the room that had a particular quality to it. I had sat in silences like it before, at the cultural integration desk, when the intake officer had asked my mother what she did professionally, and she had said, "emergency trauma surgery," and the officer had needed a moment to locate the right form. The silence of a process that had run correctly and produced a result it was not built to accommodate. "What happens now?" I asked. "We run a supplemental," the center assessor said. The supplemental was the language depth index. She explained it the way she had explained the ladder, not apologetically, not with any particular weight, but with the precise care of someone who needs the procedure followed correctly because the output matters. The language depth index was a cross-channel assessment. She said it measured, simultaneously, a candidate's active working vocabulary in their primary language, their capacity for structural transfer between languages, and their processing speed on grammatical inference tasks. It had a ceiling, like the ladder, though the ceiling was calibrated differently for juveniles. The left Keth assessor administered it. The format was spoken questions and answers, not a haptic panel, which was the first time the assessment had been interactive. She asked me a series of questions in VETH Standard. I answered them. She switched to a constructed language I had never heard before, provided a 30-second grammar briefing, and asked the same questions again in the new structure. I worked through the grammar in real time, building the response as I went, catching 2 places where the briefing had implied a rule that the question structure then violated, and adjusting. She switched to a third language, Keth Formal Register, which I had heard but never studied, without a briefing. I recognized roughly 40% of the lexical roots from the VETH cognates and built the rest from context, answering slowly the first time and faster on the follow-up questions as the pattern solidified. She stopped the index after 22 minutes and checked the output. The silence this time was shorter but denser. She passed the panel to the center assessor. The center assessor looked at it and said nothing. She passed it to the right Keth assessor, which was the reverse of the ladder handoff. It went left first that time, right first this time, which told me that neither of them was sure which of them was supposed to respond. "Your cross-channel transfer rate is above the instrument's measurable range," the center assessor said at last. I was working through the grammar in real time, I said. I wasn't drawing on prior knowledge. Yes, she said. We understand that. The rate at which you built the working grammar in real time, without prior study, under assessment conditions, is the result we are discussing. She set the panel down very carefully. The index has a cap built into its design. The cap assumes that without prior exposure to a language, inference speed will be constrained by the processing time required to construct grammatical rules from examples. That is true for every species in the instrument's calibration set. It took me a moment at the start, I said. It took you less than 40 seconds to construct a working grammar for an entirely unfamiliar language, she said. After that, your response time was faster than candidates who have studied Keth formal register for years. She was quiet for a moment. The instrument doesn't have a way to log this result accurately. It will file you as a system error. I'm not a system error, I said. No, she said. You are not. She said it with a flatness that was not dismissive. It was the flatness of a precise statement, the kind that doesn't need emphasis because the fact is plain enough. What happens now is that we run the third standard instrument and the board consults. All right, I said. The third instrument was the Threat Response Index. This one I had not read about, which meant it was either proprietary to the Institute or old enough not to have made the public index. The center assessor administered it herself. She placed a second haptic panel in front of me, smaller than the first, warm to the touch in a way the other hadn't been, and explained the procedure. I would see a series of scenarios. Each scenario contained a variable element. My task was to assign a threat value to each scenario on a scale from 0 to 100. The scenarios were hypothetical, she said. They were not drawn from any real event. I worked through the scenarios. They were not difficult in the sense of requiring specialized knowledge. They were difficult in the sense that the threat variable was rarely the obvious thing. A scenario that looked like a resource conflict was actually a proximity problem. A scenario that looked like a communication failure was actually a trust problem. One scenario presented what looked like a routine supply negotiation, and I had flagged it at 94 before the center assessor caught herself watching me work and looked away. The reason was simple. 3 of the 6 parties in the scenario shared a historical grievance the framing hadn't mentioned, but the framing's own language, specifically the choice of meeting location and the order in which the parties were listed, implied one of them had less information than the others. That asymmetry was the actual threat. The supplies were a reason to be in the same room, not the problem. I flagged what I thought the actual threat was in each case and assigned the value accordingly. I finished. I set the panel down. The center assessor picked it up. She read the first output line and stopped. She read the second. She set the panel on the desk in front of her and looked at me with an expression I could not read, not hostile, not alarmed, something more careful than either. Your threat response signatures are non-standard, she said. How so? I asked. For scenarios flagged as non-threatening, your index reads 0. For scenarios with an active threat variable, your index maxes the scale. She paused. For every scenario in between the ambiguous ones, the partial threat situations the instrument uses to establish gradient, you averaged out. I saw a lot of them as either one thing or the other, I said. The partial threat ones mostly looked like they had a clear answer that the framing was obscuring. The center assessor looked at me steadily for a moment. The instrument is designed to produce a gradient, she said. Most candidates have a gradient. It tells us how the candidate processes ambiguity. I process ambiguity, I said. I just resolved most of it before I assigned the value. Another silence. This one was longer than the first 2. The left Keth assessor said something to the center assessor in a dialect I didn't speak. The center assessor replied in the same dialect. They went back and forth twice. I did not try to follow it. I had enough languages to know when a conversation in another tongue was processing information, not deciding something, they were triangulating, not conferring. "We need to run an additional instrument," the center assessor said. "This is not a standard part of the assessment. I want you to understand that before we proceed." "I understand," I said. "Do you consent to the additional instrument?" "Yes," I said. The center assessor left the room through the side door. She was gone for 11 minutes. During those 11 minutes, the two Keth assessors sat in their chairs and I sat in mine. The left one looked at her panel. The right one looked at the middle distance, specifically at the point 3 feet to my left, which was the kind of not looking that was still a form of looking. I thought about what my father had said that morning and about the difference between assessing and confirming. The center assessor returned with a second assessor I hadn't seen before, older, the Veth lineage stronger in this one, the cranial structure more pronounced, carrying a case sealed with a dual lock panel. She set it on the desk beside the other instruments and opened it with 2 sequential palm presses. Inside was the mesh probe. I learned later that the mesh probe was not kept in the assessment suite. It was stored in the archive wing, 2 floors down, in a sealed case that required dual officer authorization to open. It was not, the center assessor explained, a standard intake instrument. It had been developed for use in cases where the standard battery produced ambiguous results, a fine-tuning mechanism, she called it, intended to establish the precise architecture of a candidate's cognitive pattern when the other instruments had not resolved it. The second assessor, she introduced herself only by title, senior archivist, had administered it 40 times in her career. It was the most sensitive instrument in the board's possession. She assembled it with the care of someone handling something that had value beyond its function. The probe itself was a headset, light, cool, fitting loosely over my temples, connected by a fiber lead to a panel the right Keth assessor would operate. It would not hurt, the center assessor said. It was a read-only instrument. It produced no sensations, only a faint pressure behind the eyes that might feel like thinking hard about something. The senior archivist fitted the headset herself. Her hands were steady. She checked the fit at both temples, looked at the fiber connection, looked at the panel, and gave a short nod to the right Keth assessor. "I'm going to ask you to do something while the probe runs," the senior archivist said. "Just think about whatever you would normally be thinking about. Don't try to do anything specific. Don't try to focus. Just let your mind do what it does." "All right," I said. She activated the panel. What I normally thought about, on a Tuesday morning after eggs and a courier summons, was roughly the Veth stellar drift compensation papers I hadn't finished reading, the 7-beat cycle from the resonance array, which was still running at a low level in the background of my attention, the partial translation I'd been building from the second spoken passage during that same instrument, whether the supply negotiation scenario from the threat index was drawn from a real historical event, and a question about the double doors on this wing, and why the stone was from off-world, and what that said about the Institute's sense of its own continuity. I did not report any of this, I just let it run. They ran the probe for 4 minutes. The right Keth assessor read the output. She turned the panel to show it to the center assessor. The center assessor looked at it for a long time. She handed it to the senior archivist. The senior archivist read it, handed it back, and then did something I had not seen her do since she entered the room. She sat down, without looking for a chair, in the nearest available seat. "The mesh is reading multiple simultaneous primary architectures," the center assessor said. "Not one dominant structure with secondaries, multiple primaries, all active, all at full operation." "Yes," I said. "This is not a result the probe has returned before," she said. "In this institute." She looked at me. "In any record we have access to, 4,017 species assessed over the history of this program. The mesh has returned this output once." She set the panel down. "This morning." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. "I need to consult the registrar," she said. The board's mandate does not cover unclassifiable results. Formal decisions outside the standard tier system require registrar review. She stood up, which was the first time she had stood since I'd entered the room. This will take some time. Please remain seated. She left through the side door, taking the senior archivist with her. The two Keth assessors stayed. Neither of them spoke. The left one looked at me with an expression that might have been curiosity and might have been something more complicated than that. The right one looked at her panel, then at the mesh probe headset still resting on the desk, then at her panel again. I looked at the instruments arrayed along the table, 5 of them now. The resonance array's receiver panel, the ladder haptic interface, the language depth index record, the threat index panel, the mesh probe. Each one had been built by someone who understood before the session began what the results would look like. The range of possible outputs was a closed set for each instrument. Something within that range came in and the instrument registered it, and the system filed it. The door opened after 12 minutes. Not the side door, the main one from the corridor. The reception clerk leaned in and said something to the right Keth assessor in a low voice. The right Keth assessor looked at me, then at the left one, then went to the door and had a brief exchange with someone I couldn't see. When she came back, her expression had changed from careful to something I would describe as braced. "The director of admissions would like to observe the consultation," she said. To the left Keth assessor, not to me, though I was the only other person in the room. The left Keth assessor looked at the instruments on the table. She looked at me. "The consultation is a board matter," she said. "The director is aware," the right Keth assessor said. "She would like to observe." There was a pause. The left Keth assessor turned to me. "You have the right to decline additional observers," she said. "The assessment is a private process." "I don't mind," I said. "She can come in." The director of admissions was Veth, old lineage, tall in a way that was not about height but about posture, the kind of tall that comes from never having had reason to make yourself smaller. She wore the senior administrative formal, the full collar with the Institute's founding charter seal embroidered at the clasp. She looked at the 5 instrument panels on the table. She looked at me. "You're the human," she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at the mesh probe output, which was still visible on the right Keth assessor's panel. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at the ladder result. Then she looked at me again. "How long has this been going on?" she asked. Not unkindly, with the directness of someone accustomed to getting to the center of things without approach paths. "The assessment started about 2 hours ago," I said. Something in her expression moved, not quite humor, but adjacent to it. "I mean the parallel processing. How long have you been doing it?" "My whole life," I said, "as far as I know." She was quiet for a moment. "And you came here to join the junior observation track?" "Yes." "Why?" I thought about the honest answer. "The Institute is the most serious research institution in this sector," I said. "The observation track is the only way a junior candidate can access the labs and the working seminars. I've been reading the Public Research Index for 8 months, and there are 6 questions I want to understand better, and 2 of them I think I have partial answers to, and I can't get further on my own." I paused. "And I like being around people who take questions seriously." The director of admissions looked at me for a moment longer than the question required. Then she looked at the ladder result one more time. "6 questions," she said. "6 at the moment," I said. "The number changes." She looked at the right Keth assessor. "Tell the registrar I'll join the consultation," she said. Then she walked through the side door without waiting for a response. The right Keth assessor looked at me. The left Keth assessor looked at the door. Neither of them said anything. I sat in the chair and waited. She was Sorvan, pure lineage, tall and fine-boned, with the deep navy skin tone of the northern sub-branch. She carried nothing. The center assessor followed her and stood to the side. The director of admissions came after she had been in the consultation, then had joined it directly through the side door and took a position at the far edge of the table, standing, hands clasped. The senior archivist did not return. The registrar looked at the instruments on the table, then at me. "You are the human child," she said. "Lena Vasquez," I said. "Yes." She sat in the center assessor's chair and looked at the panels arranged in front of her. She went through them in order: the resonance array, the ladder, the threat index, the mesh, without speaking. She went through them twice. Then she looked at me. "How old are you?" she asked. 12, I said. "And you understand what this assessment is for?" "Classification," I said, "for the observation track, so the Institute knows how to place me." "You have been educated on Earth?" "Mostly, some distance learning in transit, some here." I paused. "My father runs informal sessions when we're moving between postings. He's thorough." "What does your father do?" "Cartographic survey. He maps gravitational drift corridors. He's been doing it for 18 years. I thought for a moment. "He's very good at holding a lot of spatial data at once. He says the job teaches you to see the space between things, not just the things." The registrar looked at the resonance array output. "When you sat through the first instrument," she said, "the tones and spoken passage and visual display, what were you doing? What was your mind doing?" I thought about how to answer that. "All of it," I said. "I was doing all of it at once." The tones were a pattern problem. There was a 7-beat cycle with 2 embedded variations. The spoken passage in the first language was about a navigational adjustment, which connected to something I'd been reading about Veth stellar drift compensation, so I was following that thread while also following the passage. The spoken passage in the second language. I don't speak it, but I was matching phoneme clusters to a language I do speak and building a partial translation as I went. The visual display had an asymmetry in the fourth quadrant that repeated on the same 7-beat cycle as the tones, which was interesting. The registrar was quiet. "I wasn't trying to do all of it," I said. "That's just what happened." "You do this habitually?" "I think so. I didn't have a word for it until you said all the channels were active. I thought everyone did." She looked at the center assessor. The center assessor looked at the mesh probe output. The registrar looked back at me. "Everyone does not," she said. "To be precise, no species in the Institute's assessment history has returned this cognitive profile. The instruments are calibrated against 4,017 species." She folded her hands on the desk. "They are designed to find a hierarchy. A dominant faculty, secondary faculties, tertiary faculties. The hierarchy is how the Institute tracks candidates, assigns instructors, selects curriculum. It is how classification works." "I don't have a hierarchy," I said. "You appear not to. Your faculties are fully coactive. There is no dominant channel. The instruments read this as either malfunction or noise, which is why they return inconsistent results. They are correct. It is not something they were built to measure." She paused. "But you are clearly functional. Your ladder completion is the highest in the assessment's recorded history." That surprised me, and I tried not to show that it surprised me, which probably meant it was visible anyway. "The problems were interesting," I said. "No candidate has completed the ladder without a degradation curve," she said. "The ceiling has never not appeared before today." I did not say anything to that. "The threat index gradient is similarly absent. You resolve ambiguity rather than modeling it, which produces a binary output the instrument is not designed to process. This is not a deficiency. It is a different method." She looked at the resonance array one more time. "And the mesh reads your cognitive architecture as approximately 11 simultaneous primary structures, all operating at full capacity." "Approximately 11, I said. "The probe's upper range is 12. We may not have the full picture." The room was very quiet. The faint hum of life support cycling was audible for the first time since I'd sat down. I became aware that all 5 people in the room, the registrar, the center assessor, both Keth flanking assessors, and the original reception clerk who had come in at some point during the registrar's review without my noticing, were looking at me with a quality of attention I could only describe as careful. Not wary, not hostile. Careful in the way that you are careful with something you have not encountered before and want to look at clearly. "I'd like to ask you something," the registrar said, "and I want you to understand it is not a formal part of the assessment." "All right," I said. "When did this start? The parallel processing, when did you first notice it?" I considered the question. "I'm not sure I ever noticed it starting," I said. "When I was very small, I thought it was something everyone did. In school, I started to understand it wasn't, but by then it was just how I worked. My mother used to say I was too connected to everything at once. She meant it as a criticism, I think, that I wasn't focusing." "Your mother, what does she do?" "She was an emergency trauma surgeon. She died when I was 7. My father says she could run 3 procedures simultaneously in her head and hand off correctly between them while talking to a patient's family." I said it evenly, the way you say a fact you have said many times, a fact that has become a part of the permanent landscape. He always told me that like it was a compliment. The registrar was quiet for a moment. Then, "You focus," she said. "The latter results demonstrate that clearly." "I focus on everything at once," I said. "It's not the same as not focusing." She looked at me for a long moment. "No," she said, "it is not the same at all." Another silence. This one was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people recalibrating. I had learned to recognize it over 8 months at the Institute, on the station, moving through spaces designed for minds that processed differently than mine. It was not a hostile silence. It was the silence of a system that had just encountered data it did not have a category for, and was deciding what to do about that. "We have a problem," the registrar said at last, and she said it in the tone of someone describing an engineering challenge rather than an obstacle. "The Institute's enrollment classification system requires every candidate to be assigned a cognitive tier and a learning channel profile. Without a classification, we cannot formally enroll you in the observation track." "I understand," I said. "The instruments have returned results that do not correspond to any existing tier or profile. To classify you accurately, we would need a category that does not currently exist." "Can you create one?" I asked. The registrar looked at the center assessor. The center assessor looked at the registrar. Something passed between them that was not a word. "In 312 years," the registrar said, "this program has never needed to create a new category. The existing system covers 4,017 species." She paused. "You would be species 4,018. "I'm not a species," I said. "I'm human, there are a lot of us." "I am aware," she said. "The question this result raises, and it is a significant one, is whether any of the other humans assessed by other programs at other institutions have produced similar results." "I don't know," I said honestly. "I've never been formally assessed before." "We are aware of that also." She was quiet for a moment. "Though the question will need to be put to a wider research body at some point. Your result is notable." "Notable," I repeated. The senior archivist used the word unprecedented. She has been administering the mesh probe for 31 years and did not expect to retire having seen this. The registrar's expression was not readable to me in any simple way. It was the expression of someone who has been doing a job competently for a very long time and has just encountered the outer wall of the map they were working from. That is not a criticism of you. It is a statement about the limits of the instruments. "I know," I said. "The instruments are right. I just don't fit inside the range they were built to measure." "Precisely." She set her hands flat on the desk. "I need to ask you to wait outside while the board confers. This is not a routine step. We will not be long." I stood up, collected my bag from the floor beside the chair. It was a small bag, just a water flask and a notebook. I had not expected to be there all day, and walked to the anteroom. The clerk at the reception desk glanced at me and then back at her panel. I sat in the chair with my feet not quite touching the floor and looked at the double doors. I was not worried. I had been in enough rooms where systems didn't know what to do with me. The transit medical intake that had listed me as inconclusive on 2 of the standard panels. The cultural integration desk that had flagged my father's file as non-standard educational background, and spent 40 minutes trying to find the right form. The junior identification office that had required a specialist consultation to produce a biometric record because their standard template didn't match my cranial dimensions within the expected variance. The systems were not hostile. They were just built for what they'd seen before. I opened my notebook and read through the notes I'd made the previous week, half a page on Veth Stellardrift compensation that I hadn't finished thinking through. The life support hum was audible out here too, slightly different pitch than inside. I knew the station's sound profile the way I knew the layout of its corridors, not consciously, but completely. 8 months of living in a place means you know it without deciding to. The pressure equalization between corridors at shift change. The particular vibration of the external docking locks when a transport arrived. The way the ambient lighting shifted from cool to warm in the hour before the station's artificial night cycle began. I thought about the eggs from breakfast. I thought about the probe output, approximately 11 simultaneous primary structures. I thought about my mother's hands, which I remembered primarily from photographs, moving with the same purposeful ease whether she was suturing or making dinner or reading a paper, or telling a story to my 7-year-old self. My father had told me, years later, that she never seemed to be doing just one thing. Her attention distributed the same way water does, filling the whole space available, finding every corner at once, without being depleted by any of it. I wondered how many other humans processed the same way. I wondered whether the Institute would ask. I thought they probably would. I was on the 3rd page of the Stellardrift notes when the side door opened, 22 minutes after I had walked out. The registrar came first. The center assessor came behind her. Both Keth assessors remained visible in the doorway. The registrar looked at me, sitting in the too-wide chair with the notebook open, and something in her expression shifted, barely perceptibly, in a direction I could not name exactly but that I would later think of as a kind of settling, like a long calculation that had reached its conclusion. "The board has made a determination," she said. I closed the notebook. "Yes. We are going to classify you," she said. "But in order to do so accurately, we are also going to create a new classification category. This will require a formal amendment to the Institute's enrollment registry, a process that involves senior administrative sign-off and a review period. There will be documentation filed with the parent governing body of the Institute, and a notification sent to the Assessors' Council that a new category has been opened." She paused. "The last time this was done was 312 years ago." "What happened 312 years ago?" I asked. "A species arrived at the Institute whose cognitive architecture was distributed laterally across their whole biological collective, rather than housed within any individual member. The existing categories couldn't accommodate them, because the categories were built around individual minds." She looked at me with the same careful quality the whole room had had for the last hour. "We created a new category for them. The category has been used twice in 312 years. Their species and one other, 40 years later, with a similar distribution pattern." She was quiet for a moment. "The new category will be yours alone." "For now," I said. "Yes," she said, "for now." "In practical terms," the center assessor said, "it means you will receive a provisional enrollment confirmation today under a placeholder designation while the permanent category is established." "That's fine," I said. "The new category will require a name," the center assessor said. She was looking at her panel, not at me. "For the registry, the convention for new category designations in this system is a 3-part descriptor, structural type, predictability index, and signal pattern." She paused. We have been discussing what the appropriate designators would be. What did you decide? I asked. The center assessor looked up from her panel. Her expression was the closest thing to unguarded I had seen from her all day. Composite, she said. Indeterminate. Ambient. I turned the 3 words over. They were accurate. I could not argue with any of them. Composite because the structure was multiple, not single. Indeterminate because the instruments couldn't define a dominant faculty. Ambient because the processing was always present, always full, distributed through everything the way sound is distributed through air, not louder or quieter depending on where you listened, just there. Composite, indeterminate, ambient, the registrar said. Class 0, pending tier assignment. The tier assignment will require a new rubric. We cannot place you within the existing tier system because none of the tier boundaries apply. The rubric will take longer than the category. Weeks, possibly a month. That's fine too, I said. I'm not in a hurry. She looked at me. You are 12, she said, and it was not an accusation or a protest. It was an observation, delivered in the same careful tone she had used all afternoon, as if she were noting an interesting variable. I know, I said. And you have lived this way with this cognitive architecture for your entire life. As far as I know, I said. She was quiet for a moment. The center assessor was quiet. Both Keth assessors, visible in the doorway, were quiet. The reception clerk had stopped working and was looking at her desk. I have a question, the center assessor said. She said it carefully, the way you phrase a question when you are not certain the question will be welcome. Go ahead, I said. The parallel processing, the coactive faculties. Is it something you can modulate, increase or decrease? I thought about it honestly. I don't think so, I said. It's not like a dial I can turn, it's just how I pay attention. I paused. I've tried sometimes when teachers wanted me to focus on just one thing. It doesn't really work. I can tell the other channels to be quieter, but they're still running. She wrote something on her panel. And during the latter, she said, during the latter levels, you mentioned the tones from the resonance array were still active in your processing. Is that accurate? Yes, I said. I was aware of them throughout. They weren't distracting. They were just present, part of the background. She wrote something else. So the processes don't interfere with each other. No, I said. They actually help sometimes. One thing will notice something that's useful to another thing. The tone cycle informed how I read the visual display during the first instrument, same structure. I wouldn't have caught that if I was only running one channel. The center assessor looked at the registrar. The registrar looked at me. Is that useful? I asked. Potentially very useful, the registrar said. For the rubric. She extended a hand, the formal farewell gesture in Sorbonne professional custom, flat palm presented outward. I had learned it during cultural integration, and I returned it without hesitating. Her expression did another of those small, barely visible shifts. Your provisional confirmation will be delivered to your father's quarters by end of day, she said. Orientation for the junior observation track begins at the 8th hour on the 3rd day of next week. You are expected to attend. What should I bring? I asked. Your data card, a notepad if you prefer physical notation. Questions are welcome in the junior track. It is the appropriate place for them. She looked at me with the expression I would later understand was the look of someone who had spent most of a professional afternoon relearning something they thought they already knew. You may also bring your own questions about the curriculum. We suspect you will have several. Are there Institute Index resources available to observation candidates? I asked. Specifically the archive tier. I've been working through some of the public materials on VETH stellar drift compensation, and there are gaps I'd like to fill. The registrar looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at the center assessor. Something passed between them again, brief, calibrated. Archive access is granted at the 2nd tier of enrollment, the center assessor said. Observation candidates receive 1st tier. I see, I said. However, the registrar said, and there was something in the word that was neither concession nor humor but something in between. A candidate who has just prompted the opening of the first new cognitive category in 312 years may find that certain archivists are willing to discuss specific research questions directly. She was quiet for a half-beat. I would suggest speaking to the senior archivist when you begin orientation. She asked me before she left whether you would be attending. She did, I said. She did. The registrar dropped her hand. The farewell was complete. The senior archivist has been administering the mesh probe for 31 years. She has also been doing independent research in cognitive diversity for most of that time. She told me before she left this room that today was the most interesting Tuesday she had had in her professional life. I thought about that. I'm glad it was interesting, I said and meant it. I put the notebook in my bag. I zipped the bag. I stood up and slung it over my shoulder, and it sat the same way it always sat, a familiar weight. Thank you, I said. I'll be on time. The registrar gave a short nod. The center assessor went back to her panel. Both Keth assessors remained in the doorway. The director of admissions was still at the edge of the room. She had not spoken during the formal exchange. Now she looked at me across the length of the table, with the same directness she'd brought through the door. She was the kind of person who communicated most through economy. The things she didn't say were as precise as the things she did. 6 questions, she said. Yes, I said. You said 2 of them. You have partial answers to. Yes. What are they? I had not expected that. I thought for a moment about whether to give the short version or the actual version, and decided that the person asking was not asking for the short version. The first one is about the relationship between cognitive load distribution and pattern recognition latency, I said. Specifically, whether a mind that distributes load across multiple simultaneous channels sees patterns faster than a mind that processes sequentially, or whether sequential processing with full channel depth achieves the same resolution given enough time. I think the answer is that it depends on whether the pattern is static or emergent. Distributed processing sees emergent patterns faster, because it's reading multiple timelines at once. But sequential processing can achieve deeper resolution on a static pattern if given enough iteration time. The director of admissions looked at me steadily. The second one is about the Veth-Stellardrift compensation models, I said. Specifically the third-generation models, the ones that use resonance layer anchoring rather than fixed positional reference. I think there's an asymmetry in the resonance equations at the lower frequency range that the model treats as noise but that might be real signal. I don't have the math to test it. I need access to the primary data set. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, the third-generation models are in the restricted archive. I know, I said. I've been working from the public abstracts. She looked at me for one more moment. Then she looked at the registrar. Then she looked at the director of admissions in the way of someone nodding a data point for future reference. I'll speak to the archive committee, she said. Then she walked out the door without further preamble, which was how she had arrived. I looked at the registrar. The registrar looked back at me with the expression of someone who had, in the last 4 hours, extended the outer boundary of her professional experience by a measurable distance. Be on time, she said. I will, I said. I walked out through the heavy double doors. They closed behind me with the sound of something meant to last. The corridor outside was bright and wide, polished floor running toward the transit junction 50 meters ahead, the blue-gray light of the station's ambient cycle coming through the high window panels on the left. 2 Sorbonne students were coming toward me from the direction of the lecture wing, deep in a conversation that was clearly about something else entirely. A maintenance unit rolled past on its circuit. Everything was ordinary in the way of a place that had been doing what it does for longer than most civilizations have existed. A place built on the certainty that it had seen everything worth seeing and filed it correctly. I stood in the corridor for a moment. I thought about composite, indeterminate, ambient. I thought about class 0. I thought about a drawer that hadn't been opened in 312 years, now open, with my name on the first file inside it. I thought about what my father had said that morning, that the assessment was routine, that every species had a profile, that the process was just confirmation. He was right about two of those things. The process was indeed confirmation. It had confirmed what the instruments could see and what they couldn't. That was a kind of information, too. I thought about the tones from the resonance array, the 7-beat cycle with the 2 embedded variations, still running in some part of my attention even now, in this bright corridor, 4 hours after the instrument had been turned off. I had not tried to keep it running. I had not decided to. It was simply still there, the way a piece of music stays with you after it ends, except that it was also there alongside the partial translation from the second spoken passage, and the spatial memory of the assessment room's dimensions, and the supply negotiation scenario from the threat index, and the question I still wanted to resolve about the off-world stone in the double doors. All of it running, none of it loud, just the whole shape at once, the relationships between all the parts, the places where things connected. Then I thought about orientation, and whether the junior observation track would have access to the Institute's full index or only the public portion, and whether the Veth Stellardrift compensation papers I'd been reading were in the restricted archive or the general one, and what the right approach would be to ask about it without making it sound like I was already mapping the library, which I was, or had been for the past 2 months. The senior archivist had asked whether I'd be attending. She'd been doing independent research in cognitive diversity for most of a 31-year career, and had just had her most interesting Tuesday. I had 4 things to tell my father. I counted them as I walked: the ladder, the mesh, the new category, orientation at the 8th hour in 3 days, and a 5th thing, though it wasn't quite a fact, more of an observation, the kind of thing he would know what to do with. That the system had been built to confirm what it already knew, and instead it had found something it didn't have a file for, and the people running it had responded the way good scientists respond to data that breaks the model. They didn't force the data to fit, they changed the model. That seemed important. That seemed like the kind of institution you wanted to spend time in. He would set down whatever he was reading, and he would listen. And then he would be quiet for the length of time he was always quiet when something had happened that he needed to think about. And then he would probably make more coffee. And he would ask questions, because he always asked questions, because the work of mapping requires knowing exactly where the edges of your knowledge are, and not pretending they are further out than they actually are. I had walked halfway to the transit junction before I registered that I was already thinking about what I'd say to the instructor on orientation day. The first question, the angle of approach, the particular shape of the silence that would probably follow it. Not because I wanted to produce a silence, just because some questions had that quality, where the honest answer required the person giving it to reorganize something they had already organized. And that reorganization took a moment, and the moment was visible. 312 years since the last new drawer. I wondered how long the second one would take. Orientation was in 3 days. I was planning to be early.